NATO foreign ministers met in Prague at the end of May 2024. The meeting's primary objective was to establish a consensus that would permit the use of Western-donated weapons to attack military targets within Russia's borders. Before this meeting, the West prohibited the use of donated Western weapons against targets within Russia. In 2023, French President Emmanuel Macron became the most vocal advocate for the complete removal of usage restrictions of these weapons. The Ukrainian leadership publicly pushed for the removal of rules around the use of donated weapons as the Russian spring offensive threatened Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city. Other NATO leaders discussed the issue, leading to a partial agreement in Prague that permitted the use of weapons against targets within Russia. Prior to the meeting, the Russian leadership, aware of this discussion, threatened retaliation over this Western escalation but was not specific on what the retaliation would be. This week, there is some clarity of potential Russian retaliation from this Western escalation. This week, Russia and Belarus started the second phase of a joint nuclear drill. Belarus hosts Russian nuclear weapons, and they practice tactical nuclear weapons deployment alongside Russian troops. This is not the first nuclear weapons exercise or drill that the Russians have conducted since the start of the Ukraine war, during which they have also threatened to use nuclear weapons against both Ukraine and the West over their war policy in Ukraine. The Russian government specifically announced this nuclear drill in response to Western approval for the use of its weapons against Russian territory. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov made the following statement to a question about the drills. The situation on the European continent is quite tense, which is provoked every day by new decisions and actions of European capitals hostile to Russia, and above all, by Washington. The United States stated that there had been no change in Russia's strategic nuclear posture. Another statement, directly responding to the escalation in Western weapon policy, came from Russian supporters of Russian President Vladimir Putin. The US media reported some of their public statements, suggesting that Russia should respond by deploying missiles in South America, Central America, Cuba, and Mexico. This was in response to the decision by the West, including the United States, to allow Ukraine to use its weapons to attack sites in Russia. Russian media supporters also mentioned the possibility of sending Russian missiles to North Korea, and they expect President Putin to make a state visit to the country as early as next month. Russian allies frequently make grandiose declarations, hoping to elicit reactions from the West, gauge public sentiment, or erode Western resolve. This week, Russia made another threat, which, while not directly related to the new West Ukraine weapon policy, mirrored the growing tensions between NATO and Russia regarding Ukraine. The Ukrainian Air Force is expected to take its first delivery of US-made F-16 Fighting Falcon fighter aircraft from the Netherlands this summer. The F-16s require well-maintained runways and hangar facilities, and it is also expected that Russia will target Ukrainian airfields that will station the fighters. Both the Ukrainians and NATO nations understand that the Russians will target Ukrainian facilities to either prevent the use of F-16s or destroy them on the ground. Ukraine has stated that they plan to retain some F-16s in NATO countries for safekeeping until their operational needs dictate their transfer to Ukrainian bases. Andrei Kartapolov, the head of the Russian Duma's Defense Committee, told the Russian media that NATO bases hosting F-16s that launch attacks on Russia were legitimate targets for Russian attacks. Kartapolov specifically discusses the bases used by F-16s to attack Russia as legitimate targets, thereby tying this threat to the use of Western weapons against Russia. These threats from the Russian government and its allies are nothing new. Russia has been threatening the West on a regular basis. Russia has consistently refrained from implementing its threats against the West, limiting Western war escalations by targeting Ukrainian targets like power grids and apartment high-rises, with the aim of weakening Ukraine's people's commitment to the conflict. The West has become ever bolder to cross previous self-imposed deadlines, and to do so despite Russian threats of escalation. The West has increasingly challenged Russian bluffs and is becoming more assertive. Russia has noticed this pattern without changing its threatening rhetoric, so at some point, Putin needs to fold and stop threatening, which is what the West has counted on, or Russia needs to call and follow through with the rhetoric. This is not to say that it is just a war of words between the West and Russia over Ukraine. the Russians have the battlefield advantage despite the Western weapons. Using threats without implementing them makes Russia appear weak on the global stage, and it cannot afford to lose allies who assist in circumventing sanctions to maintain funding for its war machine. This support could fall away under Western pressure and the apparent Russian weakness to stand up to the West. The West knows the Russians have the long-term advantage, and their continual escalation of weapons and weapon policy appears to be a sign of desperation to keep Ukraine in the war, keep Russia from winning, and not having to commit its own troops to fight. The West must undertake all these measures and devise a strategy to maintain popular support for Ukraine. The longer the war goes on, the harder the status quo will be to maintain.